Welcome to the 53rd episode of the Head Kick KO podcast. Today we are doing a breakdown of UFC Fight Night, Sean Strickland versus Jack Hermansson. After that, we're going to talk a little bit about the new season of Tough, and we're going to end it off by looking forward to next week's pay-per-view, which is UFC 271, headlined by Israel Adesanya and Robert Whittaker. So, let's get started right at the main event, Jack Hermansson versus Sean Strickland. So, I'm not going to pretend like this was the most entertaining fight that anyone has ever watched. Sean Strickland did look good, though, and he did what he had to do to win. Very nice jab, very nice two behind it, and he's got really good defensive head movement. I really like the way Sean Strickland moves his head. He doesn't overdo it. Sometimes you see guys overdoing that head movement and they just end up, running around the octagon, going like this, and they look kind of silly. And then you have guys like Sean Strickland who utilize head movement very well when their opponent is attacking. So I was really impressed by that. And I also liked the teeps that Sean Strickland was mixing in. Teep is one of my favorite strikes in MMA, so naturally, anytime I see someone throwing a good teep, I will always mention it. But that was going for him as well, and most importantly, he was able to stop the takedowns. It's very obvious that if you're fighting Jack Hermansson and you cannot stop a takedown, you will probably lose that fight. So, Sean Strickland showed that he's got some good takedown defense on him, and that's important in this 185-pound division, right? If you're looking at guys like Brunson, who's ahead of him in the rankings right now, if you're looking at a guy like Vettori, all future options for Sean Strickland, you're going to have to be able to defend a takedown, right? Guys like Robert Whittaker, Kelvin Gastelum, Robert isn't a wrestler, but, he'll mix in a takedown if you give him that opportunity. So there's a lot of guys who are willing to wrestle in that 185-pound division. So that is a very good tool to have. And for Jack Hermansson, I think he said it best himself in the post-fight. His timing just really wasn't there, and he wasn't able to finish some of those takedown attempts, and you'll have that, and it just looked like last night wasn't really his night. So, moving forward, Sean Strickland is going to have some options, and he's going to be fighting a big-name guy, without a doubt. And looking ahead of him in the rankings, everyone from here up is, in title contention right now. So, when those rankings come out on Tuesday, he'll probably get he'll definitely get at least to the number 6 spot. I doubt he jumps Paulo Costa at number 5. And when we're talking what I would like to see next from Sean Strickland, I think he is 1 or 2 fights away from a title fight. That kind of depends on who he beats, who has the belt. A lot of variables there, obviously. But right now, the loser of that Jared Cannonier and Derek Brunson match would make a good opponent for him. And then Marvin Vettori, not a bad name. Paulo Costa, not a bad name. So Sean Strickland is in a really good position where I would understand the UFC matching him up with several different highly ranked guys. Now, for Jack Hermansson, he is not in as good of a spot, obviously. But I think a fight against Darren Till wouldn't be a terrible guy to throw him in there with. Not falling too far down in those rankings, but, Darren Till is still a respected opponent. I know they were looking at Darren Till versus Uriah Hall, so maybe that fight doesn't work out. And then if that doesn't work out, there really isn't a lot of super appealing options. He already beat Kelvin Gastelum. You got Brad Tavares, Nasruddin Imavov. So we're just going to, I think for Jack Hermansson, we might have to sit around and wait a little bit. If one of those guys behind him in the rankings, goes out there and gets a big win, I think that they would be a good option for Jack Hermansson, but we're obviously going to have to wait and see what happens with that division. And then moving on to the co-main, we had Nick Maximov versus Puhale Soriano. And Soriano is someone who I really liked coming into this fight, and I liked him going into his last fight against Dusko. I think Dusko was his last fight. No, Brendan Allen, and he's got a win over Dusko Todorovic. So really, Soriano is just outside of those rankings at 185 pounds. Brendan Allen was ranked and then lost his ranking when he lost a fight. We'll talk about him in a little bit too. But a win over Dusko Todorovic is a very good win. So for Nick Maximov to go out there and beat someone of Soriano's caliber, very, very impressive. And that is also a big step up from his last opponent too. So he didn't really get eased into this position. He got thrown right into the wolves, and he performed well. It wasn't perfect, right? But constant wrestling, constant pressure. He got caught a couple times, nothing too crazy, but he worked out of it. Good cardio, like I said, great wrestling, and I was very, very impressed because Soriano's a tough guy and a really good fighter. So for anyone to go out there and get a clear decision win over Soriano, especially when you've got two unranked guys. So for me, Soriano is a great win at that 185-pound division and puts anyone who beats him in a really good spot. And for Maximov, I mean, he's probably not going to break into those 185-pound rankings quite yet. He's probably still one fight away, I would imagine. And you've kind of got a log jam at the back of 185 anyways. You've got Kevin Holland at 14, Andre Muniz at 13, Chris Weidman at 15, Imavov at 12. So you kind of have a log jam there. So he's definitely not going to get a ranked fight next, but I don't think he is too far off. Let me pull up some names here, and we can throw some future opponents out there for Nick Maximov. Krzysztof Jotko, I think would be a very, very good fight. Maybe someone like Gerald Mershart, Eric Anders. Those are all good options. Phil Hawes, not a bad option either. Julian Marquez. He's going to have to fight someone who we have been impressed with. And, he's going to have to fight somebody good in his next fight. There's no doubt about that. And then at that point, we'll see how good he really is. All right, moving on. We had one of the best prospects in the UFC, Shavkat Rakhmonov, fighting Carlston Harris. And this was my favorite performance on the card. Shavkat Rakhmonov, just the way he fights is he has a style that I really like, and he landed a really good spinning kick to the body before he eventually got that finish with that spinning kick to the head. He also had a really, really nice takedown and a really crafty trip off the fence. So he's got grappling too. And, this really isn't anything new. Shavkat Rakhmonov is someone I've spoke about on this podcast before. And especially his win over Alex Oliveira. Very good win. And I think the most telling thing about Shavkat Rakhmonov is just if you look at his finish rate, right? His finish rate is 100%. That's obviously incredible, but I think the numbers on the split there were 8 submissions to 7 knockouts. So he can end a fight on the feet, on the ground. He's a very well-rounded fighter, And I think you probably have to give him a ranked guy, right? He's running through a lot of these unranked guys that they're giving him. And, he's beat respected opponents. So it's not like he's, only beat bums. So I think that it's time to move him into those rankings at 170 pounds. You could make the case he doesn't quite deserve a ranked fight yet. I'm not going to pick straws. You've got Muslim Salikov, you've got Santiago Ponzinibbio, Li Jingliang. I'm not mad at any of those fights if they get booked. You could go Michel Pieda. I think that would be a really interesting fight. And then the winner of that would definitely get a fight against a ranked opponent. Chaos Williams. There's a lot of strong names there that you could match Rakhmonov up against. Daniel Rodriguez, also very good name there. So there's a lot of options for him. Whether he gets the ranked guy, I think he should get a ranked guy. If not, he's going to be fighting someone that's, maybe a couple slots outside those rankings. So he's going to have a tough test in his next fight. And if Shavkat Rakhmonov keeps fighting the way he has been fighting, he is going to get fast-tracked for a title. And I will tell you this right now. If we're looking at just prospects in terms of the future of some of these divisions, 170 pounds looks tremendous. You have, obviously, Khamzat Chimaev, who everybody loves, everyone thinks is tremendous, and I'm not going to argue about that. But you also have Rakhmonov, like we just talked about, and you also have Sean Brady, who already has a win against Michael Chiesa, so I'm not sure if he's a prospect anymore, but he's a younger guy who hasn't been in those rankings long, who looks really good. Obviously, those prospects at 155 pounds are great as well, but, those three guys at 170 are all tremendous prospects. Now, moving on, we're going to move right down to Brendan Allen versus Sam Alvey. And this obviously wasn't the originally scheduled fight. Sam Alvey was supposed to fight Phil Hawes. And then for Sam Alvey, this is very unfortunate the way this played out, right? He is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 losses in a row. One draw tossed in the middle of that. And the worst part about that is he's fought tough guys. And in a fight where a lot of people thought he could win against Phil Hawes, he ends up having to fight Brendan Allen, who is someone that a lot of people really like, including myself. So Sam Alvey kind of got the short end of the stick here once again. So he's probably going to remain in the UFC. I saw something that said he might take some time off, but Sam Alvey for now is taking some time off, it sounds like. For Brendan Allen, very smart of him to step in and take this opportunity on short notice against someone in Sam Alvey who is well known, whether that's for good or bad reasons. Anytime you beat someone with a name, that has value. And I think at this point, he is very close to getting another shot at those middleweight rankings. Like I just said with Nick Maximov, the bottom half of those welterweight rankings are kind of packed right now. So, he might not get that opportunity right away. He might have to fight someone, once again, who's just outside of those rankings. And that is a theme of today's episode, guys who are almost ranked, but not quite ranked yet. And that's what's going to happen when you only have one ranked fight on the card. But anyways, we will continue. And we'll go down to Bryan Battle versus Treyshawn Gore. This was a fight that I really enjoyed watching. A lot of people say this is the Ultimate Fighter true finale. And regardless of what your opinion on that is, it doesn't really matter all that much at the end of the day. And for Battle and Treyshawn Gore, they both look good in their own ways. And I think that Bryan Battle came in with a great game plan to fight Treyshawn Gore. The way that Battle kind of gave the illusion that he was going to let Treyshawn Gore walk him down. And, he was fighting, I don't want to say off the back foot because he wasn't really, truly fighting off the back foot, but he spent a lot of time in between that black line on the outside of the cage and up against the cage, right? In that couple feet of space there. And he was doing a good job fighting from that angle. And the main reason was because of that teep I mentioned before. I love a good teep. And Bryan Battle really was hitting Treyshawn with those teeps. And I think that's what caused the lack of output from Treyshawn Gore. I mean, anytime he, when you're fighting someone who's throwing teeps repeatedly, Bryan Battle's just hitting him over and over again with those teeps. So he has to watch out for those. He can't just come in, Battle is doing a good job of keeping range, even though his back was against the cage. And not to mention, Battle has a very fast 1-2. He landed a couple good 1-2s. So for Treyshawn Gore, that inability to close the distance, I think, might have been the biggest problem in comparison to output, which he did need more output. But when he was he did find some very good angles, land some really nice shots. So these are both two guys where I think in 3 years we're going to look back and these two are going to be fighting again, but they're both going to be ranked guys. I think both of these guys have a lot of potential. I think Bryan Battle is a little bit, he's further ahead right now, right? And obviously you can't predict how people will progress in the future. So I don't know how anything happens, later. But right now, Bryan Battle is a little bit ahead, and he proved that last night. But I think that Treyshawn Gore does still have a future in the UFC, and for Bryan Battle, he's going to start taking on some more prospects and see if he can work his way into those rankings in a couple years. Now, there was one last fight that I would like to talk about from this fight card, and we got to skip around a little bit, but that last fight is Akeem Dawadu versus Mike Trizano. And Akeem Dawadu is one of my favorite fighters to watch in the UFC. Very, very entertaining guy, and I love the way that in that last fight he attacked all three levels. He throws very, very strong leg kicks. He's willing to attack the body. And obviously, it's an MMA fight. You're going to be punching to the head. So he hit all three areas very well. He utilizes clinch work to, I don't want to say keep him out of danger, but almost play with the pace a little bit and play with the timing a little bit. So he did very well utilizing clinch when he needed to. And shout out to him for this, because this was one of my favorite strikes of the night. There was a moment where Trizano threw a 1-2 and Akeem Dawadu ducked underneath both of them and countered with a leg kick. It's nothing major, but he was able to land very strongly with the leg kick. So I thought that was just kind of a cool strike and something that kind of stood out to me that I thought, oh, wow, that's cool. I like that. But Akeem Dawadu has a lot of potential in this 145-pound division. Mike Trizano is no easy fight, and he went out there and won that fight very clearly. His last loss is to Movsar Evloev, who a lot of people think is one of the best guys, one of the best grapplers in that division. And Akeem Dawadu went out there against him, lost the first 2 rounds very clearly. He was getting taken down a little bit. And then in the 3rd round, he turned it around, which is usually not something you see when one guy's, putting a high pace together and landing a lot of takedowns. Usually if that happens for 2 rounds, it'll happen for the 3rd. He was able to turn it around, win the 3rd round of that fight. So things like that are impressive to me because, you can kind of fight your way out of that hole. So I really like Akeem Dawadu as a fighter. And once again, I think he's someone who should be fighting ranked opponents. But like every other division right now, from 45 to 185, there's a lot of good guys in that 10 to 15 range, right? And Shane Burgos at 14 is a fight that stands out to me. I think that would be very entertaining. And that fight was already supposed to happen once. I don't remember why it got canceled. Someone had to pull out. You know how those things go. But, yeah, Akeem Dawadu, very impressive. Sadiq Youssef at 12 also would be a fun fight. Alex Caceres at 15, that's a fun fight. So I think Akeem Dawadu has a lot of options, and I think he should be fighting in that 10 to 15 range. And I don't even, there were other guys where I was like, oh, they should be fighting 10 to 15, but I can see them getting a fight that's not against a ranked opponent. I think Akeem Dawadu needs a ranked opponent next, because I think he has earned that right with the performance he just had. Now, like I said, that was the last fight we were going to talk about for UFC Fight Night, Sean Strickland versus Jack Hermansson. And the only piece of news that we're going to touch on this week is The Ultimate Fighter. The Ultimate Fighter, if you missed it, the UFC announced that Juliana Pena and Amanda Nunes would be the coaches. Now, a lot of people weren't too happy about that, and, neither was I, really. I think there are too many good options for heated rivalries with good trash talkers and really entertaining personalities. And I just don't think that Juliana Pena and Amanda Nunes have that. If you look at the fight if you look at the press conference they had the first time they fought, it really wasn't too entertaining of a press conference. It wasn't fun to watch, and I don't think we need a whole season of that. They also announced the fighters that will be fighting. Once again, there were some good selections, there were some bad selections. Muhammad Usman, who is the brother of Kamaru Usman, will be fighting in the heavyweight portion. Very excited for that. On the contrary, there is a 43-year-old who hasn't fought in like 10 years, who is 5-4, and he's going to be fighting as well, right? So, I just don't exactly understand the thought process of putting a 43-year-old in a show that is supposed to be, for up-and-comers who want to break into the UFC. It just doesn't make much sense to me, and that's whatever. And at the end of the day, what is failing the Ultimate Fighter is not the coaches they pick or the fighters they pick, because they can make those things work. At the end of the day, the way that last show was edited, if you didn't watch the last season of The Ultimate Fighter, you didn't miss much. In the past, some of the most entertaining moments of The Ultimate Fighter are interactions between guys, right? Two dudes arguing in the kitchen over who's going to eat the last apple can be entertaining, right? Nick Diaz had some very entertaining moments on The Ultimate Fighter when he was on it. Now, what the show has gotten to was you don't know anything about any of the fighters, and then the first time a fighter fights, you see 25 minutes of them talking to pre-recorded footage and explaining their life prior to the UFC. So, to me, that is where we're going wrong. You don't know, and the worst part about that is you don't get to hear anything about these guys really until they fight, right? So when you have 8 fights before everybody gets introduced into the show, you're 3/4 of the way through the season before you get a solid introduction to who everybody is. No other reality television show will do that. They won't hide a character from you who's a part of the show until you're 75% of the way through. It's just not how it works, right? So if you don't edit the show well, it doesn't matter if Jorge and Colby are the coaches and you have, 8 guys who are 10-0 and some of the best prospects outside of the UFC going at it, it doesn't matter if they edit the show terribly. So that is just kind of my own beef with The Ultimate Fighter. And when you pair that issue with unentertaining coaches and, lackluster prospects, you're going to have issues. And that's unfortunate because it is a very strong concept and a show that could work, but we're watching it tank in front of us. And that is one of the most critical takes I've had on any UFC-related issue in a very long time, because we're just watching them run the show into the dirt. So we're going to get off that little rant about The Ultimate Fighter because, frankly, it's not that much fun to talk about. And we are going to look forward to next week's fight card, which is UFC 271, headlined by Israel Adesanya and Robert Whittaker. And in this main event, I think the number one thing that I'm looking forward to is if Robert Whittaker can get a takedown. Obviously, Robert Whittaker is a tremendous striker, but it is very hard to beat Israel Adesanya in pure kickboxing. I want to see if he can go out there and get some takedowns, right? And like I said earlier, Robert Whittaker isn't an elite wrestler, but he can time a takedown well. And if he gets in good positions, he will finish that position and find a way to be on top, right? It's what he did against Kelvin Gastelum. He times his shot very well, gets, locked up underneath the butt, gets double underhooks, gets a strong position on a leg, he will finish that takedown. So if he can get some of those opportunities and land some nice takedowns, I think he has a good shot at winning this, right? And that's not because he'll be able to hold Izzy down 4 or 5 rounds, but if you can make Izzy concerned about the threat of a takedown, you are a lot more likely to win just because you're going to see less output, right? Looking at Marvin Vettori versus and Paulo Costa, if you compare their fights against Izzy, that threat of a takedown is really what held Marvin from not, getting out kickboxed for 2 rounds, right? Paulo didn't threaten that takedown at all. Izzy just chewed up the front leg and landed some shots to the head, puts him out. It's very hard to beat Izzy without that threat of a takedown. So, and I think Robert can bring that to this fight. Now, the question is, even with that, can he win? Yes, he can win. I don't pick him to win. However, I think that Izzy is good enough at defending takedowns that even if okay, let me reword that. I think if Robert is able to take Izzy down, I think that Izzy can do a good enough job at getting back up, and I think he will be able to land the better shots on the feet. Now, do I think Izzy's going to go out there and win this fight 50-45 or knock him out in round 1? I don't. I think this is going to be an incredibly close fight. I think it's going to go to decision. And I imagine something very close, like a 48-47 or a 49-46, where there's a couple rounds in there where you could give him the rep. So, I think Robert makes this an entertaining fight and a competitive fight. I think Israel Adesanya goes out there and eventually gets a win. Now, in the co-main event, we have Derek Lewis versus Tai Tuivasa. This is also an interesting fight because if you were to ask me who is the better fighter here, in my opinion, it is very clearly Derek Lewis. With that being said, we have seen Tai Tuivasa go out and land some big counter shots and put guys away. Most notably, Greg Hardy. That counter hook that he landed on Greg Hardy was pitch perfect and is something that could put anybody out. If he lands that same hook against Derek Lewis, Derek Lewis will be knocked out. Now, what does that mean, right? I think, right, and I'm not too confident in this pick. I think Derek Lewis is going to be able to avoid some of those shots. And I think Derek Lewis is the more well-rounded fighter at the end of the day. I think that Derek Lewis is going to be able to go out there and get a takedown if he needs to, right? If we're, in a fight where it's 1-1 going into round 3 and you've got a minute left and you need a takedown to win, I think Derek Lewis could go out there and get it, especially against Tai Tuivasa. Now, excuse me. Now, with that being said, I'm not counting Tai Tuivasa out because anyone with his power can win this fight. But I just think that Derek Lewis has more options to go out there and get a knockout, whether it be boxing, whether it be counter-striking, whether he throws a head kick in there, whether he throws a flying knee in there. I just think that this fight's going to come down to who lands the shot that puts the other guy away first. And I think Derek is going to land that shot first. And I think that if something happens where Derek needs to adjust his game plan to wrestle, I think he also has that. So I'm leaning Derek Lewis, and I'm thinking KO here. And we'll just say round 2. Now, another interesting fight on this card, Jared Cannonier versus Derek Brunson. This one has big implications in this title picture. I think the winner gets the next title fight very clearly, especially if, say, Jared Cannonier goes out there and knocks Derek Brunson out and then calls out Izzy. Izzy's probably going to call him out if he wins, right? I think, and the same works for Derek Brunson. So I think that the winner of this fight is going to fight for the belt. Now, who will that winner be? I'm going to go with Jared Cannonier. As much as Derek Brunson is a tremendous wrestler, I just think that Derek Brunson's last 2 fights were fights that were just some of the best, last 3 fights actually, were some of the best matchups he could have been given. Looking at Darren Till, Kevin Holland, and Edmund Shabazian, all great strikers who all struggle to defend a takedown. And at the end of the day, I think Jared Cannonier is going to do a lot better of a job at defending a takedown than any of those previously mentioned guys. And I think that he might not be as good of a striker as someone like Darren Till, as someone like Kevin Holland or Edmund Shabazian, as those guys are all very strong strikers. If you look at those fights, especially Holland and Till, they landed good shots on Derek Brunson. There were times where Kevin Holland would land a nice 1-2 and kind of wobble Brunson, but then Brunson gets a takedown. And then, he has 4 minutes of ground control. He's no longer hurt. The round's over, and we're starting the next round. So I think Jared Cannonier, in those moments where he touches Brunson, I don't think Brunson's going to be able to get the takedown the same way he was in a fight like Holland or Till. So I am going to pick Jared Cannonier. I think he gets it done by knockout, and I will say round 3. Moving on in this card, we've got Kyler Phillips and Marcelo Rojo. Give me Kyler Phillips. I think that Kyler Phillips is a very fun and versatile fighter. And, you can make the case that he won his last fight, and the only reason he's fighting an unranked guy is because he got robbed in his last decision. So, for Kyler Phillips, I think he goes out there and gets it done against a Marcelo Rojo. Now, Nasrat Haqparast and Bobby Green is another tremendous fight. This is a fight that I saw get booked, and I was like, oh, wow, they did a good job booking that fight. Tremendous matchmaking, and I'm going to lean towards Bobby Green. I think that Bobby Green will be able to stay on the outside, land a lot of 1s, a lot of 2s, put some combos together, land some nice leg kicks. I think that Bobby Green goes out there and gets this done. Give me Bobby Green by decision. Now, we have Andrei Arlovski versus Jared Vanderaa. This is a fight that I'm going to lean towards Andrei Arlovski. Andrei Arlovski, actually, Andrei Arlovski usually goes out there and gets 3 wins in a row, and then gets beat by a solid up-and-comer. And, he's got 2 wins right now. But if you look at the guys that Andrei Arlovski has beat and the guys he has not beat, he has lost to Tom Aspinall, Jairzinho Rozenstruik, Augusto Sakai, Shamil, Tai Tuivasa, Marcin Tybura, Francis Ngannou, Josh Barnett, Alistair Overeem, Stipe Miocic, and Anthony Johnson. And then, after that, we're getting back to 2011 if we want to go any further. So we don't need to go back any further than that, really. And then, on the contrary, he's beaten guys like Stefan Struve, Junior Albini, Ben Rothwell, Felipe Lins, Tanner Boser, Carlos Felipe, Chase Sherman. Now, why did I just run through all those names? Well, at the end of the day, Andrei Arlovski, in his current place in his career, he's beaten guys who aren't good enough to be contenders or champions. But he's beating the guy who is not quite at that level, right? You have to be elite if you want to beat Andrei Arlovski. And unfortunately, I don't view Jared Vanderaa as an elite level guy. I don't think he's on the same level as an Aspinall, a Jairzinho Rozenstruik, an Augusto Sakai. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Not everybody can be a top 15, top 10 fighter in the world. With that being said, I think that Andrei Arlovski is going to go out there and get this done. Moving on, Casey ONeill versus Roxanne Modafferi. Casey ONeill, one of the best prospects in that women's flyweight division. And I think that she's going to go out there and get another win. Her last win over Antonia Shevchenko, very, very impressive. And I think, Roxanne Modafferi at the end of the day has already announced her retirement. And I just think there's something about knowing that you're done, right? At the end of the day, Roxanne Modafferi, whether she loses this fight or wins this fight, doesn't really affect her all that much. And I think that, builds into your subconscious. And, I usually pick against fighters who are retiring just because, you're retiring for a reason. You're not retiring because you're at the peak of your game, unless you're Khabib or GSP or someone like that. If you are, ranked, in the middle of the pack and you're retiring, you're not retiring because, you can go out there and win a championship. So I think that Casey ONeill gets it done. And Roxanne Modafferi, regardless if she wins or not on Saturday, she's had a great career, and I wish her the best in her post-fighting career endeavors. Now, Alex Perez versus Matt Schnell. Anytime we're putting bantamweights against each other, it's a potential fight of the night candidate. That's just how the 125-pound division works. I'm leaning with Alex Perez on this one. As much as I like Matt Schnell, Alex Perez is someone who, aside from his loss to Davison Figueiredo, has looked very, very good. He hasn't fought too recently, but looking at his most recent wins, I like Alex Perez as a fighter. I think he gets back on track against Matt Schnell. And we'll say by decision once again. Now, skipping around a little bit, Carlos Ulberg versus Fabio Chernatt. I really like that fight as well. This is the type of fight that you need to watch on the prelims. Carlos Ulberg gets into fun fights. Fabio Chernat is someone that, I really liked coming into the UFC. He looked very impressive, and unfortunately, he's got losses to William Knight and Alonzo Menafield. Those are two guys who are very respected, and he's fighting another guy in Carlos Ulberg, who's also very respected. I think this is going to be a close fight back and forth, but I'll take Carlos Ulberg. We'll go by decision. Now, another sleeper fight, Renato Moicano and Alexander Hernandez. These two guys are guys who at one point people thought would be top fighters in the UFC. Renato Moicano got the privilege to fight Aldo, Chan Sung Jung, Brian Ortega, Rafael Fiziev. So, he is no bum. Alex Hernandez, on the other hand, he has been, at one point in his career, he was fighting Cowboy Cerrone. So he is someone who's also used to be a top prospect, and now he's just not at the same level anymore. But both of these guys are coming off very impressive performances, both coming off finish wins in their last fight. I think this is a fight of the night sleeper. And if you were to make me pick, I lean Renato Moicano. I just think he's a little bit of a better striker here, and I think I don't even think that's that true. But I think he'll be able to use some length here to stay on the outside and land some good shots against Alexander Hernandez. Now, the last fight that I'm going to talk about before we end this is Blood Diamond, Mike Mathia versus Jeremiah Wells. Now, this is a fight that is something I look at as one of the fights where it's like, I can't believe they booked this fight, right? Blood Diamond, if you don't know who he is 3-0 in MMA, and he is a training partner of Israel Adesanya and all those guys, and he has been talked about as someone who, when he comes into the UFC, he's going to make a splash, right? That's always been what people have thought about him. And on the contrary, we are having Jeremiah Wells, who in his last fight absolutely just destroyed Warley Alvarez on short notice. And that was his first fight in the UFC. And for him, he has been looked so highly upon after that performance. He has had fights booked against Jake Matthews and Tim Means. Both of those fights got canceled, however. He's also had fights booked against Baeza. Miguel Baeza, that is. I don't know why I only said his last name. But Miguel Baeza. So Jeremiah Wells is a very respected guy who, in his last performance, I was blown away by how good he looked. So I'm going to pick Jeremiah Wells in that one just because when I see someone and I go, wow, I'm really impressed by what you just did, I usually pick them in their next fight. That's just kind of how it goes. So pretty standard there. Now, like I said, that was the last fight we were going to talk about on UFC 271. And that is the end of this episode of the Head Kick KO podcast. I hope you enjoyed. We will be back next week to break down UFC 271, and we will talk about what happened in the main event, in the co-main. We'll talk about probably some other fights on the main card. We'll talk about anything interesting on the prelims, and we will talk about what is next for all of those guys. And it should be fun, so thank you, and make sure you tune in next week. Goodbye.